welcome back to Frankly Speaking. Let's call this episode, or should I say, Volume 5 of the Integralist Chronicles. And I'm your host, Frank. Okay, listen. Tonight I want to start right around 1995. Actually, you know what? No, let's start in 93. I had gone through a conversion process where I was starting to come back into my faith. And I went through a process of studying apologetics for a few years as I was trying to fend off the wave of Protestantism and how Protestants were continuing to, again, feed off of Catholics who really didn't know their faith in many respects. And I touched on this in the previous podcast. But I was in the midst of a cultural battle in Southern California against Protestants. I was a one-man show doing my own thing, kind of vocation that I took up for myself. And that's where my intellectual curiosity really began in many ways. And this would set me up for sort of my political future and kind of my historical future and how I began to see things. And so as I'm going through that, I'm now in a period of history in the 1990s that I'm starting to see, and this is just my personal opinion, as maybe that decade that we could proclaim where America collapsed socially and morally. I believe that's the generation, right? We have, again, the 1920s generation that really begins the sexual revolution. In the 1960s, we see the full evolution of the sexual revolution. By my generation, the 80s, it's all happening underground, the moral depravity. But by the time we get to the 90s, there is no more shame. And as I said in the previous cast, I believe the reason why it comes out in the open 1990s is because the last generation, my grandparents' generation, that generation of, Americans would call them the greatest generation. I would call them my grandparents' generation, the pre-World War II generation, are starting to die off. And they were sort of the last gatekeepers of morality, the last gatekeepers of shame and blame, where a lot of the moral depravity in the 70s and 80s remained underground. Not all of it, but a lot of it. But once that generation, the pre-World War II generation, begins to die off, then there's nobody that we have to prove our moral principles to anymore, right? And 1995 particular to me is an interesting year. As I said before, you have two types of music that rise up in the 90s, early 90s. We're coming away from that hip hop, or not hip hop, but that poppy music of the 1980s, right? The very colorful artists and things like that. But then all of a sudden, the 90s things get dark. Something changed. What was that? Well, on one hand, we saw the mainstreaming of rap music, which was, in my opinion, a form of grievance music within the Black community in the inner cities. I'll leave that for somebody else to comment on. But there was another form of music that arose in the 90s, and that was grunge music, which I found very interesting. Because if you listen to grunge, it was a very dark and angry form of music. But it was a music that was predominantly conducted by the offspring of white Protestants. You hear the anger in the music, and you hear the screeching of these individuals that are calling for their fathers in this music, questioning, why did you abandon me? Why did you leave me? We see this element of human brokenness. And you ask me the question, well, how do you know it was white Protestants? Because when you have a form of music that is essentially the ultimate, I hate my parents' music, Italians don't look at family that way. Even in the midst of our moral disorders, we don't hate our parents. I never related to the music. I never understood this notion that you're supposed to hate your parents when you're a teenager. And if you talk to classical liberals this day, they believe that's just simply a natural fruition of life, that every generation rebels against the previous generation. And again, coming from a Catholic culture, that's something that we really didn't go through. It might have happened on an individual basis, but not in the grand scheme of things. The close-knit sort of relationships that Italian parents have with their children and children with their parents, those things are really a big deal. What we're seeing here is, again, well, and I will also premise with this, especially from Italians who are first generation, who our parents go back to the old country, right? those kids are still tied to the old country and those values. And the parents of those Catholic kids never went through a sexual revolution. That didn't happen in Italy. It didn't happen in Sicily, that sexual revolution, not till later on, not till after American democracy and liberalism are kind of imposed, and then it begins to happen later on. But in Sicily, it happens even later than America, right? My family, especially my mom and dad, they didn't have anything like a sexual revolution. These were Catholics. They were raised in Catholic cultures. There was Catholic mores, Catholic principles. They went to church. They believed the faith. They participated in the processions and the great feast days of the church. I came from a home where the sexual revolution, it wasn't there. It wasn't. I know that's hard for a lot of Americans to believe that, but it wasn't there. And that's why when you have these cohesive cultures and families that are together and have avoided, or how should I say this, where their particular culture did not go through a sexual revolution, it's night and day on how we view things. That's why I said in another cast, again, I said it was strange when we Catholics began to mingle in American pluralistic culture, because it was the white Protestants and the Black Protestants that had the broken families, the divorced families. So with American Protestantism going toward or devolving within the midst of this 1960s generation, that grunge generation, those are the offspring of the 1960s. Those are the youth coming to full fruition, whether they were born in the late 60s or the early 70s. Those are your 20, 21, 22, 23-year-olds now that are gravitating toward this very angry music, expressing their grievances with their broken families through music. Let's remember the 1960s. The pill was made over the counter. Abortion legalized. Pornography legalized. What else was there? I mean, name them all, right? Women are pushed out into the workforce by the 1970s because of the inflation of the 70s. So not even mom is home now, right? In Italy, the mother is still home for the most part. I'm sure now they're working because liberalism and youth system has creeped in there. But when you put all these social factors, all these liberations, here's one, no-fault divorce, 1969. And who ushered in no-fault divorce? Was it the far left? Was it the liberals? No, it was Ronald Reagan in California who actually signed into law the first no-fault divorce law. Isn't that interesting? Now, the Gipper later on will come out and say that he regretted that. Is one of his biggest mistakes. But as I said before so many times, as an Italian, I find it strange how we put moral issues up on the ballot or leave it up to representative leaders anyways. They shouldn't be deciding these things. For thousands of years, it was the church that decided moral issues, but in America, we do things differently, right? We put moral issues on the ballot, right? Which is something else. But no-fault divorce is passed. What else you got going on? You got a ton of stuff. The disordered agenda is starting to liberalize as well, too. You got all kinds of issues going on in that time span. Along with the rise of feminism, the family takes a massive turn to the left. And as the family is starting to break down, this affects the American population very adversely. And that 90s generation is the full fruition of the breakdown of the American family in 1960s, the white Protestant American family for that matter. And there you have this angry kind of music, just screeching. I mean, if you listen and watch some of these interviews, a lot of these gentlemen that were in these bands at the time, they'll tell you how angry they were. And a lot of them were crying out for lack of parenthood in their lives. A lot of them specifically calling out for their fathers for abandoning them. And unfortunately, from my understanding, talking to a friend of mine who followed this genre of music very closely, a lot of these young men wound up dead a few years later because of the tattered relationship with their families. And really, the 90s is the full fruition of the sexual revolution in general. I mean, the music is one thing. The music is a sample of what's starting to go on. But when you have, again, things like Three's Company that begins in the 70s, right? And again, by the 80s, that whole generation is still there, right? Our grandparents, right? where they're still upholding morality to the very death. But underground, it's happening. And once that generation dies off, again, then we could take off the mask of immorality. And it was in the 90s that where people started shacking up out of wedlock with no shame at all now. It became normalized, and all kinds of other social dysfunctions. Young ladies now on the pill shamelessly, young ladies getting abortion when the pill wasn't working. Young ladies now pursuing careers in college like men, which shifts the dynamic of the family and how families are going to raise. We're now not having as many kids anymore, and now we're dropping kids off at daycares is what we're starting to do, and we've got all kinds of problems. It really, the assault and attack of the family is really, and the destruction of the family is on full fruition, on full display at that point in the 1990s. And then 1995 happens. I think there's something very interesting. I find it interesting. I mean, it's a little thing, but I find it interesting. Maybe nobody else will, but I do. 95, Hollywood puts out a remake of the Brady Bunch. You guys remember that? The Brady Bunch remake? Now, we all love the Bradys in the 60s and the early 70s, right? The wholesome American family, right? 3 boys with 3 girls with hair of gold, and the wholesomeness, and Mike Brady being the ultimate father, kind, compassionate, and raising these strong families, talking about difficult moral issues, at least according to 1960s. And it was very wholesome at the time. In fact, in the 1980s, when we have more of these soft line family shows, things that are more family friendly, like Growing Pains or the Cosby Show, or Different Strokes, things that portray positive families, that's where the Brady's really takes off in reruns. It became huge in the 80s. We loved that. But in 95, the Brady's are remade. Only this time, it's sort of a sarcastic comedy, where the Brady's now are stuck in a 1960s time warp, but they're living in 1995. And Hollywood lets us know what the culture is like in 95, despite the Brady's in their minds being stuck in a 1960. Still wholesome, right? But what was the portrayal in that movie of the American family? It was the angry family, children disrespecting parents. It was the disordered agenda. It was the ear piercings. It was the grunge music, right? The Seattle garage bands that was sweeping America at the time, in a general overtone of this moral depravity and the collapse of the family that now the Brady's were living in. It's really remarkable if you think about it, because, again, maybe 25 years earlier, Hollywood is portraying the Brady's in their own world, their real world at the time, as very wholesome. But 25 years later, Hollywood says, no. Now we gotta put reality out there. And in many respects, they were right. They were right. I know a lot of conservatives say, well, Hollywood's just pushing buttons. And this is true. They do push an agenda before everybody else. But they also reveal what liberals are thinking and how liberals are living in the world at the time. And when you have a generation of kids that have now grown up in divorced families, broken families, thanks to no-fault divorce and a whole lot of other moral depravities, well, now the 90s, we're all just, spinning our heads trying to figure it out. And that's where you begin to see the Republican Party, the conservatives, begin to collapse on moral issues, particularly after one little event politically where we had a sitting president of the United States who had, let's just say, intimate relations with a subordinate half his age. And by the time 96, 97, I believe, parents are trying to, or forced to explain to their little kids what a oral sex is, right? Remember that? And that really symbolized the decade in so many ways. It showed America in a state of moral decline. And this is also facilitated by a whole host of other shows, Friends, Will and Grace, Murphy Brown as a single mom, purposefully being a single mom without a man in the household. These are the moral depravities that Hollywood was sort of portraying, but they were also things that were real, things that were happening on the ground. And then you begin to see the culture, again, not only young ladies taking a pill, But shacking up out of wedlock, shame and blame is gone. The old guard, which was our grandparents, died away. There was no shame anymore. And now it's a free-for-all. And that will be the generation and the decade that will raise this generation now that has gone back shit crazy with all this woke stuff now, ironically enough. All this stuff builds on top of one another. And there's nothing within the realm of American culture that we can ever do to stop this, because we don't subscribe to the one true faith. We've rejected the church, we rejected the sacraments, and we're all left with these quasi half-ass political sort of machinations that we're trying to do to sort of fend off the collapse. And that's why the Republican Party in the early 2000s doesn't really become an opposition party anymore. It becomes a party that essentially says to its voter base, listen, it's over. We've lost the culture war. Let's just focus on economics, and we will manage the decline of America better than the Democrats, right? Democrats will destroy the country in 10 to 20 years. We'll take 40 to 50 years before the country is destroyed. And that's, in essence, what the George W. Bush presidency was starting in 2000, right? So this is the world that we had created by the 1990s. And for a lot of parents, especially from the baby boomer generation, they were faced with some interesting questions how they were going to deal with this. Either they were going to fight it or they were going to cave in. And what happened a lot of times is that the baby boomer parents caved in. I think a lot of it had to do with their own guilt from the 1960s because of the things they were partaking in. And I believe a lot of them didn't feel they had a moral ground to stand on when it came to judging sort of the sexual exploits or the material exploits of their own children. And they let their children go wayward. That's assuming they didn't come from a broken family. It's like I said to you before, right? It was strange as an Italian. We have these close familial bonds together. And then the American white Protestant family is all broken. Johnny's going to dad's on the weekend, and then mom on the weekdays, and then they have 2 Christmases over here, 2 Christmases over there. We found that to be the strangest thing. And it came down to the issue of divorce, because divorce in a classical liberal civilization, in this spirit of rebellion, in this spirit of freedom and liberty, had to be accepted as a form of liberty in America. If you're not happy, you have a right to break your contract or your covenant. You have the freedom to do that. That's why with classical liberals, you hear a guy like Beck, he's talking about covenant theology, right? He believes the Pilgrims, not the Pilgrims, the Puritans, what was it? The Pilgrims, when they landed on Plymouth Rock, made a covenant with God, right? And the country flourished and had a great start, and we were doing just fine with limited government and the founding principles. And then we get to the Civil War, and the country is shred apart, and we're fighting a great war over various issues. And then Abraham Lincoln has to reestablish the covenant with God. And now that everything's gone to hell in a handbasket again, Glenn Beck, once again, is arguing that we need yet another covenant with God, right? And for a while there, Glenn, for $39.95, if you sent it to him, would send you a piece of paper so you could hang on your wall, which signified your covenant that you had made with God, right? But here's the problem. There's only one covenant with God. When the likes of Beck and other Protestants are continually breaking covenants, for them to preach the establishment of more covenants is the ultimate hypocrisy. There was one covenant, and the Protestants broke that covenant during the Protestant Reformation. They subverted it. They erased 1,600 years of sacred tradition because they didn't like the rules of the game. And here comes the first of the rebellions of the classical liberals. Well, it starts with the Protestants, but again, that devolves into classical liberalism eventually, right? Because it's the Protestant Reformation that ultimately leads us to the Enlightenment. As historian Charles Columbus said, the attack has been a 3-pronged attack, right? Altar, throne, family. The Protestant Reformation was an attack on the altar. The Enlightenment was an attack on the throne. And now in the 21st century, well, 20th and 21st century, we've seen the attack of the family. And that all begins with Protestantism and their embracement of classical liberal values and the constant covenant breaking. So it's why it's so difficult to take a guy like Beck so seriously when he says, okay, it's time to now do a new covenant because it's all falling apart. It's not the way covenants work. And then it's not up to man to establish a covenant. It's not up to man to determine that the dictates or what our terms of condition are. It's up to God to establish it. That's the grand mistake that Protestants always make, because Protestants want to dictate the covenant. They did that with sola scriptura. They did that with sola fide. They concocted these two theories out of thin air after 1,600 years. And it's been that ideology that now, or that theology that spreads into, again, the philosophical and eventually the political realm. And it's the constant breaking of covenants that actually brings the great disorders that we have today. What is it when you have a divorce that happens? When you break your oath to God, you've broken a covenant. You've broken the promise you've made to God, the oath you swore to God. And when your freedom and liberty becomes before that oath, you're putting your own selfish, narcissistic ambitions before the covenant of God and before God, right? And haven't we done that in this liberal culture where we push these sort of sexual passions and break down all moral standards, and ultimately people form disordered relationships. And through these disordered relationships come bad marriages, because we've broken down the civilizational standards, starting with the true faith. And Protestantism has proven over and over again, it is a disordered relationship with God. Just look at the most liberal nations on the face of the planet, the sola scriptura nations, right? Scandinavia, the Netherlands, England. These are all Protestant nations, America, where these covenants are continually renewed, but they're false covenants. And those are the nations that liberalized the fastest. And it was those nations that eventually would attack the Catholic nations with their grand revolutions, their Masonic revolutions in the 18th century, 19th century, and 20th century, which ended with two great world wars, ironically enough. That's why I say this brave new world of all this great moral disorder, it's a Protestant classical liberal world. You guys used to blame the Catholics all the time for all these odd things, these nuances like Galileo and the Inquisitions, a lot of which were lies, by the way. But now the tables have been turned. As civilization collapses, how many classical liberals will take the blame now? None. They'll shift blame to their leftist siblings, right? The communists, the Marxists is what they'll do. But it was the classical liberals that set these principles in motion. It was the Marxists and the communists that simply took classical liberalism to its most logical conclusion. And here's where we're at right now. It's like I said to you before. Secularism, leftism. These are the enemies classical liberals tell you is the problem with America today. But what they leave out is liberalism in the middle, or more specifically, classical liberalism. If somebody says to you that secularism and leftism are your problems, but they don't admit that liberalism in between is a problem, they're lying to you, because each one is a natural step. It's a natural step to the next move, right? And so this is where we're at, ladies and gentlemen. By the 90s, we have a completely morally depraved population. The president of the United States and his sexual scandal really highlights what the decade was. And that would be really the setup for the next generation that we're living through now, in the craziness of a world that divides Americans more than ever before. But again, it was all, preceded by the breakdown of the family. Because faith broke down, true faith broke down, and the principles of classical liberals were beginning to fail. Remember, America worked for a while when Protestants, Jews, and Catholics could get along and agree on basically the same things. But with the devolution of liberal ideologies, we begin to see the differences within these camps. And we've seen them even in Catholic camps to a certain respect, as Catholicism has been infiltrated with the ideas of the classical liberals. And that's why Catholics now have their problems. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. The 1990s, I lived it. I was there. The moral depravity, the shacking out of wedlock, sex before marriage was like, I mean, it was just normal now. It was an everyday exercise that everybody partook of. The sacredness, the holiness was taken away from the act itself. And that brought about many illegitimate children, which contributed to the moral dysfunctions. The family began to break down. The understanding of marriage, the understanding of proper morality, the understanding of proper formation of how relationships are formed, that was gone. It became a materialistic culture, and it became a heavy sex-based culture. And that's what we were determining partnerships or marriages on, which of course is devoid of God. And when you devoid God of a relationship, oftentimes it's going to lead to the meltdown of that relationship. Not always, but oftentimes. That's why we Catholics always knew this idea of this Protestantized divorcee culture. It was there. We saw it from the get-go. Do Catholics get affected by that later on? Yes. Yes, they do. But it takes multiple generations for liberalism to kick in. But that first generation always respected their parents. There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. The 1990s. I think the decade we could proclaim America died. And now we're all living through the ashes and through the ruins for the most part. I want to thank you for joining me tonight. This is Frank signing off, or Frankie speaking. Good night, everybody.